Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting us to be here today. So I'm Anna Hames, and in a moment you'll be meeting my colleague Louise Clegg, and we're the clinical psychologists in the liver service at King's College Hospital. And I'm specifically part of the transition service at King's. So I see young people right up to the age of 25 as they're moving from the paediatric into the adult service. And Louise works with younger children and families. So in preparing the talk today, we're aware that there's a huge amount of expertise in the room of being a family living with a chronic illness. But as people have mentioned then, both you and your children will all be a whole range of ages and be at different points in that illness journey. And what we're hoping to do in this talk is to provide some ideas that are going to feel relevant no matter what age or stage you're at. So I'm going to start by providing a framework just to think about family life in general and how illness fits with this. And then I'll hand over to Louise, who's going to give us some ideas about how we can help make sense of illness and hospital experiences and help children, young people and siblings to do the same. So as our disclaimer is that we're not going to be going through lots of research findings or statistics, and we're not going to be focusing on any specific problems or difficulties that we see. But as already mentioned, then there's an excellent workshop this afternoon which focuses in on a few more of those specific issues. As psychologists working in physical health, we're very mindful that families facing serious paediatric illness are essentially ordinary families facing extraordinary stresses. And with that in mind, I just want to get you back to thinking about normal family life and what that means for you. So I'm just going to pose a few questions I'd like you to take a moment to think about. And when I say family, that's quite a broad definition. So it's whatever family means to you. That might be children, siblings, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, foster carers. So whatever family means to you, if you can just think about these things for yourself. So first of all, what are the top 3 things about family life that bring you the most happiness and joy? So what's the really good stuff about being part of a family that makes it all worthwhile? Next, I'd like you to have a think about what are the top 3 things about family life that you find the most challenging or difficult or stressful. So the things that can make life a little bit tricky sometimes as being part of that unit. And finally, I'd like you to think about what role does liver disease or transplant play in family life? Did it come up when you were thinking about those really good things or the stressful things? What relationship does it have to the good and the tricky stuff? And how has that changed over time? If I was going to ask other members of your family the same questions, would they give exactly the same answers as you, or would it be different? And similarly, if I was to ask you those questions in, say, 6 months' time, a year or 10 years, how similar would your answers be? Now, my guess is actually they'll probably be quite different both from each other and over time. And that's because we know that families have what we call a life cycle. So families have, as a whole, a set of different needs and demands that change over time. And we go through periods of stability where it feels like we've kind of got family life a little bit sorted. We all know what to expect. We're carrying on as normal, whatever normal might be for your family. But we then reach a time where we all have to change and adapt to new challenges. That might be because new people come into the family or leave the family. There might be changes like starting school, moving house, moving jobs. And at this time, everyone in the family needs to start changing and adjusting their roles to fit with those new demands. That might be quite an unconscious thing that we do naturally, or it might be something that we actually have to stop and think about as a family in terms of how we're going to work with these new challenges. And within these various stages, there's some times where it makes really good adaptive sense for families to cling together and to be really dependent on each other and really closely kind of coheed. That's not a word. And so, for example, thinking about when there's a newborn baby in a family, then that baby is entirely dependent on its caregivers for all of its needs. So it makes a lot of sense for families to gather around that child and to be there as a really close family unit. In contrast, there's going to be other life stages for that family where it makes much more adaptive sense to be able to give each other a bit more space and independence. So thinking about adolescence, for example, and young adults developing into adulthood. Then at those times, people need to be separating a bit more allowing a bit more privacy, and for families to try to figure out where those new boundaries are to allow the independence while also doing it in a safe way. And what most people tend to find is it's those transitional points between those stable points that can provide real challenge for us. And if we carry on doing the same rigid things we've always done, that's where we tend to run into problems. But trying to find that new way of being can be quite hard. Now, in the sort of family therapy literature, they spent a lot of time trying to map on what these exact life stages are. But I think if we ask any of us in the room, then it's not so much that there's one prescribed path we all follow, it's just this idea that we change. And if you look at these examples, then I'm sure you can see for families with young children compared to adolescents, children becoming adults and leaving home, and families in later life, there's quite different demands on the family as a whole. So for example, for grandparents in the room, thinking about what it means to be a grandparent now of children who are now also parents. Within families, though, we're also collections of individuals. And in the same way families go through changes, we all go through our own changes. And we pass through a series of what we call sort of developmental tasks. So they're sort of skills, abilities, and things we need to learn to be able to do in order to progress to the next life stage. There might be physical changes, so we need to sort of get bigger and stronger over time and go through maturation processes such as puberty. There's also changes in the way that we think and learn and see the world. And those changes go on for quite a long time, actually. So there's lots of research now showing that there's sort of structural and functional changes that happen in the adolescent brain right up until our mid-20s. There's also differences in our social worlds in terms of what makes up our social world and how important they are. So going from that very small infant where typically parents are your whole social world, broadening that out. In adolescents and young people, that's typically where your peer group becomes the most important part of your world, and then going on to form intimate relationships and perhaps having families of your own. And there's also different educational and work challenges that we pass through. And what we know is that you've got an interaction between everybody in the family doing their own individual thing that they're passing through and trying to gather the family life cycle around that, and you've got that interaction between these two processes. And now all of these things are true for all families. But for those people where there's chronic illness around, we add in some additional challenges. So I'm sure I don't need to be telling all of you what some of the challenges of liver disease and transplant can be, but certainly from the families that we see, and that's very much backed up by the research literature, then there can be all sorts of challenges that it brings. Practical things, that might be travelling to appointments, going for blood tests, picking up prescriptions, taking time off work, school, and the other difficulties that can bring, such as financial and other. We know there can be huge emotional stress at different parts in the journey, whether it's adjusting to the new diagnosis, thinking about what it means to have this condition, or to have a child or sibling and so on with this. We've heard a bit today about some of the social implications, and that might be the impact on relationships both within the family and outside. And that's often something I spend a lot of time thinking with young people in terms of developing friendships, maintaining friendships, and having that sense of feeling connected to others even when your experiences might feel quite different than others. And there's also a knock-on impact on education. So there's some conditions that we know might impact on the way that people are able to think and learn about things. And also we know that our young people are more likely to have extended time off school, which can have implications in that way. But again, if you're sitting there thinking about your own illness journey, then that's likely to fluctuate over time. Because in the same way that individuals and families have life cycles, so do illnesses. And the illness is going to make different demands on you at different times in its course. So thinking about the impact it has at diagnosis, or times of less stability compared to when life might feel a little bit more settled. The implications of living with uncertainty compared to actually having a plan. And an idea I find quite helpful when thinking with families is it's thinking about the fit between these different stages. So thinking about where the individual is, whether we're talking about the child in question, siblings, the parent, where are they at in their own life cycle? What are their developmental needs at the moment? Where are the family? And then where are the illness? And do all these connect together? So again, to give you a couple of examples, thinking about, again, a newborn baby. In that baby's life, it's appropriate for it to be dependent on its parents or family. And for families, that might be their expectation, to to be caring and to be very closely depending around that child. However, if that baby is given a new diagnosis when they're born, then the illness makes very different demands. It might be that families have to give up some of those caregiving roles and rely on a network of professionals to do some of the tasks they might have been hoping or expecting to do. And it's that lack of fit that can cause some of those other challenges. In contrast, a situation I see a lot is young people who receive a diagnosis in their adolescent years. So thinking, for example, of a 15-year-old. At that age, we know it's typical for a young person to be starting to develop more independence, thinking more about their self-identity, perhaps separate from family. There's cognitive stuff going on, so typically it's quite helpful for young people to have a slight sense of invincibility, to not perhaps think about the future so much, and to not be so aware of risks out there. Friendship, school, all of these kind of things happening outside of the family are typically the focus for young people. And the families are typically trying to find a way of negotiating around this. So changing roles around, negotiating that new independence and thinking about sort of what are appropriate boundaries now at that stage. However, we then add in illness to that, and it can have a completely opposing effect. You might suddenly be in a situation where young people are required to be slightly dependent on parents or adults, perhaps spending extended time in hospital, away from people, away from school, and suddenly being faced actually with vulnerability at a time when you're not used to thinking about things in that way. And often families who I go and see in hospital will almost be feeling bad that they're finding things difficult, because it's what families do, we pull together at times of crisis. But just even stopping to appreciate that this is an extraordinary thing that you're being asked to do at this stage, because it's not what you would expect, and it's actually not often what you need at those life stages. And almost by having an awareness and thinking about what is that fit between these different stages, we can start to think, well, what are everyone's needs? And how can we try to juggle things to try to make sure that those needs are being met and that we're adjusting as well as we can? So one idea we wanted to have is these ideas of the fit. But alongside that, it's trying to make sense of the illness. And how do we help children, young people, and whole families try to make sense of the experience of illness and of hospital? And so I'm now going to hand over to Louise, who's going to talk us through a few ideas.
Thank you, Anna. So, yeah, why is it important to make sense of this illness journey? Well, I want to try and take your minds back to when we first came into this room and the video that we were shown about the Talk, Tell, Transform programme, because I think that just answered the question that I'm posing. It's important for all of those things that those teenagers told us in that video. So we know that children who are able to understand what's happening to them in the context of their lives are able to build up a greater level of resilience, to be able just to cope with the ups and downs that their illness might create for them. By being able to make sense of their experiences in that context, makes it easier for children to be able to integrate their lives with those other life cycles that Anna was talking about, both the individual and the family. And it's the integration of these stories that help children form their own identities. Having a coherent sense of self-identity, we know, is a really, really key element in protecting improving self-confidence and increasing self-esteem. So what do I mean about meaning making, creating meaning about experiences? Well, we all understand events and experiences in our lives by creating meaning for them. Usually the events in our lives fit into a framework of understanding that we already have. However, when something falls outside of those usual experiences, we naturally strive to make sense of them by bringing together information from previous experiences. So as adults, we're able to draw on a huge number of skills and strategies to be able to make sense of novel events. Children, however, don't have these skills at that time. And so in the absence of any meaningful explanation, they'll work to find their own understandings, which do run the risk of being incorrect. So how many of you have heard children that they've been very, very scared because they've just eaten an apple and swallowed a pip? And they've become very, very worried that that pip might start to grow a tree in their tummy or something like that. So to be able to give meaning, we've got to use some kind of framework from which to be able to draw that meaning. Take today, for example. You all came in here into this room, you've sat down on these chairs and you're facing the front, and even though you know that it's lunchtime now, you're still paying attention to me and looking like you're listening to me, which I'm entirely grateful for. But where's that knowledge come from to do that? Maybe some of you have been at conferences or workshops before and you know that's how this runs. Maybe this is the first time you've ever attended a conference or a workshop, so you've drawn on your experiences of maybe being at school or something like that in order to make sense of the experience and to know how to act and how to behave. So we build our frameworks from our experiences and the stories that we grow up with, and the influences from society, from culture, even from media, for example. And these frameworks, whilst made up of the same key components, are flexible, and they change over time as we have new experiences and new information comes in to reshape them. But if our framework is coherent, then these experiences can be made sense of. And we do that naturally as part of parenting, helping children to understand novel events by giving them a framework by which to understand them. Just taking, for example, a child who's maybe going to school or changing schools, moving to big school. We all have a framework from our own experiences about how to support children to be able to do that, to know how they should act, what they should be doing on that first day, and some of those natural emotions that they might be feeling at those times. So given that understanding of how we make sense of things, we can start to think about some of the difficulties in making sense of illness. And what I'm talking about here, and I want to be really clear about this, is not necessarily making sense of why your child's got this particular condition over somebody else. It's about making sense of the illness experience, okay? So it's making sense of being in hospital, having procedures completed, taking medicines, talking to doctors. So it's that illness experience, that illness journey that I'm talking about. So I wonder whether you can think back to the time before your child or relative was diagnosed. What frameworks did you draw upon to be able to make sense of illness and chronic conditions? Perhaps it was school biology lessons. Maybe it was experiences of illness for yourself or within your family. Or maybe it was 24 hours in A&E or ER or something like that. So just spend a few minutes thinking about how did you make sense of things before you had the knowledge that you have now. So given that, I wonder whether you can spend a little bit of time thinking about what your child or relative draws upon in making sense of their own experiences. Where's their knowledge coming from? Is it their knowledge that they've gained from being in hospital, talking to doctors, talking to yourselves, from friends at school, or maybe it's their own TV programs? I think things like Get Well Soon or Operation Ouch are key components in making sense of things. But for children, one of the important things to start thinking about is understanding what developmentally they're capable of making sense of at that time. And so I just want to spend a little bit of time thinking about children's understanding and concepts of illness. There's been a growing amount of research going into this, and it seems that children's understanding and concept of illness is very much linked to their cognitive development. So thinking about something that starts when they're a very young child, where illness is just this incomprehensible, invisible thing. It's something that happens out there in the world that they're not really too aware of. From between the ages of sort of 2 and 7 years, children will start to form representations of their body, maybe through nursery rhymes, and growing an understanding of those that they can see and touch and feel, to those that maybe are inside them. Although there might still be some mistakes in their understanding. I wonder how many of you have had little ones tell you that they've got tummy aches in their head. Over time, children develop that ability to be able to create links of causality, so an understanding that illness moves from something that happens because of something external in the environment, like getting a cold because it's cold weather outside, and then moving later on to becoming able to understand that it's a result of proximity to illness maybe. So in the example of catching a cold, maybe you caught it because you were stood next to somebody or sat next to somebody in class that's caught a cold. So just to bring this to life a little bit and make it a little bit more relevant, I often ask children what they understand to be happening and what's wrong with them at that moment in time. And I was talking to a little 4-year-old boy with biliochesia who told me about his special tummy and the yucky medicines that he had to take. It made sense to him though that to take these medicines, because even though they were yucky, they were going into his tummy. So that made a lot of sense that that must be helping somehow. But he could not make sense of why he had to have this cannula in his arm that was also giving him medicines, because those medicines were going into his arm. So how on earth were they going to affect his tummy or make anything help? But as children grow older, they begin to develop the ability to create more in-depth causal links, such as illness occurring as a result of contact, that to prevent illness, you might want to wash your hands and things like that. And there becomes this greater understanding of the interactions maybe between germs and how things go into our body. The most sophisticated understanding of illness and thinking more generally about illness now involves having knowledge of the causations of illness, the interactions of biology, environmental factors, individual susceptibility, and psychological factors. So, if children are naturally going to try and make sense of the experiences of illness, it's important to make sure that they're not making incorrect interpretations, because that's where feelings of anxiety or fear or worry start to creep in. Talking together, creating that story, in the same way that those teenagers in Talk, Tell, Transform are doing, they're creating their own story, helps to create that meaningful framework. One way that we find helpful to reduce those feelings of conflict between that illness life cycle and the individual and the family life cycles. But I talk to a lot of parents who find it very, very difficult to know how to find that balance between being able to share that story with a child. And everyone here will have a different view on what and when and how you should share information. And that will depend on the frameworks that you have about illness, about parenting, about communication. However, if you are thinking about creating this story or framework, then some of the things that you might want to consider are considering both your child's experience and knowledge and your own as well. This is exactly the same, by the way, if you're thinking about helping siblings to understand what's happening to their sibling. So it's about bringing in and sharing the story with the family, maybe having a family story as well as those individual ones. Being able to connect that story to a broader context is really important, because it's really important for a young person to be able to connect that illness experience with the other things that are happening in their lives, whether that's interactions with family, friends, being at school, or indeed not being able to be at school at that time. And with that story, thinking with the young person and in your family, how and who do you share that story with? Because it's not enough just to be able to have a story and an understanding for ourselves, but we need to be able to know how to share that with others. Okay, so you'll be pleased to hear that we're moving on to the summary. We're nearly at lunchtime. And so what we really wanted to highlight here, and what Anna and I both hope that you're going away with, is a bit of a better understanding maybe of the fit, or indeed lack of fit, between the individual, family and illness life cycles. The importance of creating a meaningful framework to be able to understand illness. And the importance of these frameworks being able to be flexible, to be able to update and adjust over time depending on what's happening. But as I mentioned before, it is difficult. It's difficult to negotiate and balance the creations of these things, and it can be hard. But you're not alone in this process, and people have talked already about the huge numbers of different professionals that are available at all the 3 different centres, and in the local hospitals as well. National, CLDF and local organisations. Psychology is here too, and it's important, I just put some of the things that we help young people and families with within the hospital context, because it's unusual sometimes to come across a psychologist that's not working in with mental health, for example. So just these are maybe some of the things that we think about working with children and families with. And there are psychologists at all 3 centres, and the psychologists from King's, so Anna and myself, and psychologists from Birmingham are all here today. And if you did want to get in contact with us, then do feel free. We'd be more than happy to hear from you. Thank you very much.